All right, welcome ladies and gentlemen. Here is the video on the anterior forearm. Now, the forearm and the hand are one of my favorite parts of the human body, particularly of the musculoskeletal system to talk about. It is, at first glance, very complex, and it's difficult for some students to wrap their head around what's going on in the forearm. However, I am going to break this down for you in a way that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I've been teaching this for about a decade already, and I've come across some patterns, and these patterns are going to help you remember the names of the muscles, remember where they attach, and remember what they do. Okay, so pay close attention to everything I'm going to tell you in this video, and this is going to help you tremendously in understanding the forearm and the hand anatomy. Okay, so let's jump into it. So first thing we're going to do is cover the foundation, which is the bone. All right, the bony landmarks. All right, so we're going to review some of these structures from the distal humerus that we talked about in the anterior arm, and then we're going to go into the rest of the forearm and the hand, and you're going to see where everything is. Okay, so looking up here, so we have over here the thumb. This is the first digit. All right, this is the fifth digit out here, which is the little digit, the pinky. Okay, so that's telling us that this out here is our lateral side, and this over here is going to be our medial side. Okay, so remember the radius is always going to be on the thumb side, which is the lateral side. Okay, so I'm saying that so we can gain some orientation as to what's happening over here. Remember that the humerus is going to terminate as two epicondyles. Okay, so this is the lateral side, this is the medial side. So this is going to be our medial epicondyle, which means that this out here is going to be our lateral epicondyle, right? And likewise, remember this ridge that is superior to the lateral epicondyle, that's going to be our lateral supraepicondylar ridge, okay? The lateral supraepicondylar ridge, okay? This over here is going to be our radial head. That fits into that little radial fossa right there. This right here is going to be the radial neck. This over here is going to be a rough patch of bone, and this is what serves as an attachment site for the biceps brachii. Remember, from the anterior arm. This is going to be our radial tuberosity. Okay. Likewise, on the other side, we're going to have an ulnar tuberosity, okay, which is this rough patch of bone right here on the ulna. And remember that the ulnar tuberosity serves as the attachment site for the brachialis, okay? So radial tuberosities for the biceps brachii, ulnar tuberosities for brachialis, okay? Then remember that this projection of bone right here on the ulna that articulates with the trochlea and will fit into this coronoid fossa, this is our coronoid process, okay? Coronoid process of the ulna. Okay, I'm a stickler sometimes. There you go. All right, that's the coronoid process. So, and then here we have the shaft of the ulna. Shaft of ulna. Over here we have the shaft of radius. Okay. Then when we look at the distal parts of these bones, of both the radius and the ulna, let me see if I can zoom in to this part for you so you can see in more detail over here. So down here, we're going to have the ulnar styloid process, all right, which is that bump right there. And then likewise, you're going to have a radial styloid process, okay. All right. And then we're going to see, and then what I want to break down is some of the things that are happening over here. So remember that. So these are the bones of the forearm, the radius and the ulna. These right here are going to be our carpal bones, and we're going to talk about them in more detail when we get into the video about the hand. Okay. But for now, we're just going to do some broad strokes. We're going to talk about what you need to know in the hand in regards to the forearm muscles. Okay, in regards specifically to the forearm muscles. So this right here is a tiny bone that sits on top of another bone. This is known as the pisiform. Okay, so let me type that in for you. This is the pisiform. Okay, there's that little bone right there. And then right here, this whole bone is known as the hamate. And the hamate has a projection that comes off of it like a hook. And in this image is coming out toward us, right? So that right there is known as the hook of hamate. Okay. This down here, so remember I said that this is the 5th digit, which means this is the 4th, this is the 3rd, this is the 2nd, and this is the 1st. Okay. This right here, right, being the 5th digit, remember that each one of these digits is going to be composed of a metacarpal, a proximal phalanx, a middle phalanx, and a distal phalanx. Okay, we're going to cover all of this in more detail in the next video on the hand, but this is just an overview. This right here is a landmark on the 5th metacarpal. Specifically, it's on the base. Okay, so this is the base of a metacarpal. Up here is the head. It's the base of the 4th, head of the 4th, base of the 3rd, head of the 3rd metacarpal. So this right here is the base of 5th metacarpal. Okay, base of the 5th metacarpal. All right, then when we look over here, that means that this over here is going to be what? This is going to be the base of 2nd metacarpal. Okay, base of 2nd metacarpal. All right, and now these bases of these metacarpals, the base of the 2nd and the base of the 5th metacarpal, they're going to serve as attachment sites for muscles that we're going to see, where one of the muscles is going to be biased over here to this ulnar side, and then the other muscle is going to be biased over here to this radial side, and they're going to be muscles that control movements of the wrist. Okay, movements of the hand, essentially. All right, that occurs at the wrist. They don't move the digits. They don't move the digits. They just move the whole entire hand and wrist. Okay, so that's that, base of 2nd metacarpal, base of 5th metacarpal. Then we have the 1st digit over here. And remember that the 1st digit, the pollex, the thumb, does not have 3 phalanges, right? It only has 2. So it's going to have 1 metacarpal, 1 proximal phalanx, and 1 distal phalanx. No middle phalanx. There's a proximal phalanx and a distal phalanx. That's it. Okay. So over here, we're going to have the base of 1st metacarpal. Okay. Over here, we're going to have the base of 1st proximal phalanx. Okay. Let me move this over. It's not all crunched up. There you go. So base of 1st proximal phalanx. That's this right here. That's this right here. Okay. That's that right there. And then we're going to have the, and then here, you guessed it. What is this? This is the base of 1st distal phalanx. Beautiful. Okay. Base of the 1st distal phalanx is right there. Okay. That's that guy. That's that guy right there. Okay. So altogether, we have all the attachment sites for, the muscles that we're going to see in the forearm. Okay. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay. So first muscle we're going to talk about. Remember that I always like to talk about these things in layers, and I'm going to start from the deepest layer and work my way up. Okay. So the deepest layer we're going to come across is going to be this muscle known as Pronator Quadratus. Okay. The Pronator Quadratus. And just as the name implies, it's a pronator. It's going to pronate the forearm. Okay. So the attachments for this, very simple. Distal radial shaft, distal ulnar shaft. It literally just goes straight across like a box. Okay. Right here, one thing I want to point out, notice that I have this faint blue outline right here in between the 2 bones. This is the interosseous membrane. All right, this is the interosseous membrane. It is a membrane, a fibrous piece of tissue that attaches the ulna to the radius. Okay, and some of the muscles that are in the deep layers of both the flexor compartment, which is the anterior forearm, or the extensor compartment, which is the posterior forearm, those deep muscles, they attach onto that interosseous membrane. We're going to see that later. Okay, but I wanted that to be there so you're aware that that's a thing that exists. Okay, and that's going to play a part in all of this. So distal radial shaft, distal ulnar shaft, boom, that's what it looks like. Square piece of muscle, just like that. Okay, and basically what it's going to do is that when it contracts, remember that when I said in a previous video, when we were talking about the anterior arm, when we were talking about the difference in function between the biceps brachii and the brachialis, I told you that the biceps brachii, since it attaches to the radius, it is capable of flexing at the elbow, but it can also supinate the forearm. Okay, it can supinate the forearm, and it's going to basically put the radius in the position that you see now. Okay, this is a fully supinated forearm that we see right now. Okay, so the opposite of that is pronation. So that would be now the hand, that would be essentially the hand rotating around that way, okay, to face downward. It's kind of like when if you're sitting at a desk and you put your hands palm face down on the table in front of you, that's a pronated position of your forearm. If you turn them with your palms facing up, that is a supinated position of the forearm. Okay, so the Pronator Quadratus, what it's going to do, it's going to turn this that way, and the way it does that is essentially by pulling the radius that way, and it's going to make it rotate around the ulna. Okay, it's going to make it rotate around the ulna like so. Okay, and you can go ahead and pronate and supinate your own form so you can see what I'm talking about. But this part of the radius up here stays fixed. It's rotating in place, okay, as this distal end goes over and around the ulna to essentially rotate the whole entire hand to make it face down, okay? All right. So that's the Pronator Quadratus. The next one we have is going to be our Flexor Digitorum Profundus, okay? Flexor Digitorum Profundus, okay? I stress these names because the names are telling you exactly what the muscle does and exactly where it attaches, okay? So Flexor Digitorum Profundus, okay? This is going to be a flexor of the digits, okay? So where is it going to attach? It's going to attach all the way out here to the distal phalanges of 2 through 5. So when we're dealing with these muscles of the forearm, when you hear digitorum, that's a muscle that's going to control digits 2 through 5, all these fingers, not the thumb. The thumb has its own musculature, and those are going to all be called pollicis. Flexor Pollicis Longus, Flexor Pollicis Brevis, Abductor Pollicis Brevis, Extensor Pollicis Brevis, so on and so forth, okay? Those are going to be the ones controlling the thumb. Digitorum is going to be for digits 2 through 5, okay? And in the flexor compartment, we're going to have 2 sets of digitorum muscles. We're going to have a digitorum profundus, and we're going to have a digitorum superficialis, which you're going to see later, okay? So first, let's talk about digitorum profundus, okay? The deeper one. Profundus means profound, to be deep, okay? So, and this is a layer above the Pronator Quadratus. It's going to attach to the proximal ulnar shaft and interosseous membrane, okay? So it's going to attach to this ulnar shaft, and since it's a deep muscle, it's also going to attach to this interosseous membrane. And then from there, the muscle belly is going to split into 4 different tendons. And that muscle belly is going to split into 4 different tendons. And they're going to run all the way to the distal phalanges of digits 2 through 5. Okay. And that's going to be in contrast to the superficialis, which is going to do something a little bit differently. Okay. It's going to do something a little bit differently. That's the Flexor Digitorum Profundus, okay? And so the action for that, like I said before, flex all the digits. Flex the digits where? Where is it flexing it? At which joints? It's going to flex it at the metacarpal phalangeal joint, the proximal interphalangeal joint, and the distal interphalangeal joint. The 3 joints of the fingers are all going to be flexed by the Flexor Digitorum Profundus because the tendons go all the way to the distal phalanx and they cross all 3 of those joints, okay? Good. Next, we have the Flexor Pollicis Longus. Pollicis Longus. So this is going to go to the thumb. And this is going to be a muscle just for the thumb. Okay. And so in contrast to the Flexor Digitorum Profundus, which went to the 4 digits and was attaching to the ulna, guess what? This one, it doesn't make sense for this to attach to the ulna because it's going out to the thumb, right? So it's going to be attaching to the radius. So it's going to attach to the radial shaft and the interosseous membrane because it's also a deep muscle lying right next to the Flexor Digitorum Profundus, okay? So the Flexor Pollicis Longus is going to be in there, and that's going to look like this, okay? Flexor Pollicis Longus attaching to the radial shaft, to the interosseous membrane, 1 single tendon that will then go and attach all the way to the first distal phalanx, which is the distal phalanx of the thumb. What is that going to flex? It is going to flex the thumb joint, the interphalangeal joint, and the first metacarpal phalangeal joint. Just 2 joints, right? The thumb only has 2 joints, okay? Whereas the rest of these fingers have 3, okay? All right, next one. Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. This is the brother of the Profundus that lives up on the second floor instead of the first floor. Okay, so this is the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis. Does the same thing, right? Does the same thing, flexes the digit, but one key critical difference is the fact that the Flexor Digitorum Profundus is not going to go all the way to the distal phalanges. No, it's going to stop short at the middle phalanges. It's going to stop short at the middle phalanges. Still going to all of them, 2, 3, 4, and 5, but it's not going to the distal phalanx. So what does that mean? That means it's going to flex the metacarpal phalangeal joints here, and it's going to flex the proximal interphalangeal joints here, but is it going to flex the distal interphalangeal joints? No, it's not. No, it's not. It has no activity there because it does not cross that joint. So it cannot exert any force across that joint. Okay? And specifically, it's attaching to the sides of it. Okay? And you're going to see what that looks like in a little bit. The proximal attachments for this guy. This is not attaching to the interosseous membrane. Why? It's not a deep muscle. It's not part of the deep compartment of the flexors. Okay? The Flexor Pollicis Longus and the Flexor Digitorum Profundus have already taken up the real estate on the interosseous membrane. There is no more real estate there. Okay, so now the Flexor Digitorum Superficialis is going to start attaching to a common site where many of the other flexors that we're going to see from here on out are going to be attaching to, which is the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The medial epicondyle of the humerus, okay? That's where a lot of them are going to attach, and you're going to see that. So medial epicondyle of the humerus, it's also going to have fibers that insert onto the coronoid process of the ulna, and it's also going to have some fibers that insert onto the radial shaft, okay? And that's going to look... What is that going to look like? Let me show you. It's going to look like this. Okay? It's going to look like that. And so you can see now how all these this whole muscle belly is going to split into its 4 individual tendons for each one of these fingers. But then in addition to that, each one of these tendons is then going to bifurcate again. They're going to bifurcate again. Okay? And let's zoom in there so you can get a better view of what's going on there, right? So they're going to bifurcate again, and then the reason they do that is so that they can allow space for the Flexor Digitorum Profundus tendon to go through and then reach the distal phalanx. Because remember, the Flexor Digitorum Profundus tendon is lying deep to this tendon, right? It's lying deep to that tendon. And so it has to go through that tendon to then reach the distal phalanx. And so the superficialis tendon is going to bifurcate like so to allow passage for that tendon. And this construct right here of the superficialis tendon bifurcating with the profundus tendon going through is known as Camper's chiasm. That's known as Camper's chiasm. Okay? All right, beautiful. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. All right, next. Pronator Teres. Pronator Teres, as the name implies, is going to pronate. If it's pronating the forearm, that means it must attach to the radius. Remember what I said before. If you're going to pronate or supinate the forearm, any pronation and supination of the forearm is basically the radius rotating around the ulna, specifically the distal end of the radius rotating around the ulna. That's what supination and pronation is. Okay? So you have to attach to the radius. You have to move the radius if you want to pronate or supinate. Okay? So the Pronator Teres, yes, is going to have an insertion site onto the radial tuberosity, very close to where the bicep tendon is attaching. And then in along with the rest of the flexors, the rest of the superficial flexors that we're going to see, it's attaching to the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the coronoid process of the ulna. Okay? And so that's going to look like that. Okay? That's going to look like that. All right? Next. Flexor Carpi Radialis, okay? So now we're, again, superficial flexors. So they're going to originate at the medial epicondyle of the humerus. This is going to be the common site for all the superficial flexors of the forearm, okay? And then from there, Flexor Carpi, I want to point out radialis. Radialis. This is biased to the radial side of the hand, okay? And I have a separate lecture video where I kind of break down the function of all the carpi muscles, okay? And I'll link it over here. But this is attaching to the base of the second metacarpal, okay? It's attaching to the base of the second metacarpal. So what is that going to look like? That's going to look like this, okay? And so what does that tell us? That tells us that this muscle has no, does it move the digits? No, it has no function at the metacarpal, phalangeal, the interphalangeal, the distal. No, it doesn't move any of these fingers at all, okay? But it is going to move the whole hand. It is going to move the whole hand. And how is it going to move the whole hand? Well, it's a flexor, so it's going to flex the hand. It's going to flex the hand at the wrist, right? It's going to do that. But what else is it going to do? It's biased to the radial side. So it's also going to pull the hand that way. And what is that called? That's known as radial deviation. You could also call that abduction of the hand, but people don't really say that too much. Abduction of the hand, even though that's technically correct. People usually say radial deviation. Okay, so it radially deviates and flexes the hand. It does both. Okay, it does both. All right, that's the Flexor Carpi Radialis. Okay, and that's going to be in contrast to the next muscle. We're gonna, not the next one, so the one after. So let's look at this one, Palmaris Longus. Palmaris Longus also attached into the medial epicondyle of the humerus. This is going to insert on something that is not on this diagram. It's called a palmar aponeurosis. Okay, the palmar aponeurosis is not a bony, it's not a bony landmark. It's an aponeurosis, which means it's a flat piece of tendon. Okay, so essentially fibrous tissue that covers the whole entire palm of the hand. You're going to see the palmaris longus running and inserting into that palmar aponeurosis. Palmar aponeurosis is a triangular fan-shaped piece of fibrous tissue that covers the palmar aspect of the hand. Okay, some people do not have this muscle. Some people do not have this muscle. The way you can test to see if you have this muscle or not is you basically you touch your thumb to your pinky and then you flex your hand. And if you see a very prominent tendon presenting itself over your wrist, that is your palmaris longus. I think about 20% of the people or 20% of the population or something like that doesn't have a palmaris longus. Okay. Next, we have the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. Now, the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris, in contrast to the Flexor Carpi Radialis, which we saw over here, right, attaching to the base of the second metacarpal, biased to that radial side, the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris is going to be biased to the ulnar side, to the fifth digit, okay, to the fifth digit. And it's going to be attaching to the medial epicondyle of the humerus along with the rest of the superficial flexors. But in addition to that, since it's all the way out here on the ulnar side, and a lot of these other muscles that are here kind of pushing it off to the side, so it also attaches to the olecranon process of the ulna. Okay, it attaches to the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the olecranon process of the ulna, and then from there, it's going to run down to insert onto the base of the fifth metacarpal, and on its way there, it's also going to send fibers to attach onto the hook of the hamate and the pisiform. And what is that going to look like? What is that going to look like? It's going to look like this. Okay, it's going to look like that. All right, so that's the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris. Okay, and just like we said with the Flexor Carpi Radialis, it's going to flex the hand because it's a flexor. But in addition to that, what else is it going to do? It's going to pull the hand that way. This is not radial deviation. This is ulnar deviation. You could also call that adduction of the hand. Okay, that's ulnar deviation of the hand. So the Flexor Carpi Ulnaris does a combination of both flexion and ulnar deviation of the hand. Okay, there we go. And now we're going to talk about the last and final muscle that I want to talk about. Now, this muscle over here, brachioradialis. Brachioradialis is an interesting muscle. It does, you can't quite categorize it as a flexor or an extensor. I think about it as the boundary line between the flexor compartment and the extensor compartment. Okay. And the reason being is that it doesn't flex the hand. It doesn't extend the hand either. Why? Because it never crosses the wrist joint. It never crosses the wrist joint. It has no business with the hand. It does nothing with the hand. Okay? It inserts onto the radial styloid process. Okay? What you guys remember is this projection of bone right there. Okay? It attaches to the radial styloid process. It does not cross the wrist joint. It does not go into hand territory. Therefore, it has no function at the hand. Okay? But it is going to have function at the elbow. It is, because it's starting up here. It's starting at the lateral. Remember this ridge we talked about so many times. The lateral supraepicondylar ridge. This is where the brachioradialis is, and this is going to look like this. Okay? It's going to look like that. And what does this do? I call this the beer drinking muscle. Okay? So when you flex your elbow, Okay, when you flex your elbow, you can flex your elbow with your forearm in different positions. Okay, so you can flex your elbow right now with your palm facing up. And that is flexing your elbow with your forearm in a supinated position. The most active muscle when you're flexing your elbow in a supinated forearm position is your biceps brachii. Okay. Now let's say you turn it all the way with your palm facing down. Okay. And you flex your elbow with your palm facing down. That's now your forearm in a pronated position. The most active flexor in that position is going to be your brachialis. Okay. Now let's say you go somewhere halfway. Okay. Pretend that you're grabbing the handle of a huge 40-ounce mug of beer. Okay. And you're grabbing the handle of it. Your hand is essentially not fully pronated and it's not fully supinated either. It's in the middle. It's in a neutral position, also known as the mid-prone position. Okay. In this position, when you go ahead and you flex that elbow, that is going to, the main muscle that is active there is your brachioradialis. Okay. Some people call this hammer curls. If you're working that out in the gym, that's how you work out your brachioradialis. Okay. So, and this is not necessarily, like I said before, this is more so considered as a boundary between flexor and extensor, because if I continue going over this lateral side, I'm going to end up now on the posterior side of the forearm, and I'm going to start going into extensor territory. Okay. And that's going to be the topic of conversation for one of our next videos. All right. And so that's it. That's it. That's the forearm. Those are the bony landmarks of the forearm that you need to know of the anterior forearm and the muscle attachments and the muscles that are there. Okay. Gross anatomy is one of the most difficult subjects in the world. Luckily, it doesn't have to be. Anatomy is one of those subjects that needs constant verbal and visual repetition in order to get good at. What better way to reinforce this information than with the scientifically validated method of drawing? Neuroscience has shown us that we retain information better when we physically draw it out. That is why the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy Workbook is designed to walk you through all the layers of the musculoskeletal system, allowing you to draw the muscles into place. This is excellent for reinforcing muscle attachments, bony landmarks, muscle names, and actions. This will save you tons of time from mind-numbing tactics such as repetitive flashcards or passively listening to boring lectures. With this strategy, you can actually begin to enjoy studying again and have a much better way to retrieve the information. Order a copy of the Gross Anatomy Study Strategy today at the link below so you can spend less time being stressed and more time being blessed.